We have finally passed the midpoint of the year, which means that it's time to go through some of my favorite albums from 2022 so far, hopefully giving you something new to listen to or simply reaffirming your own music taste. Let me know some of your favorite albums from the first half of the year down in the comments below. I love listening to new things. First up is A Light for Attracting Attention by The Smile. This is essentially a Radiohead record, but just with a more fun drummer. Sorry, Selway. The project brings together frontman extraordinaire Thom Yorke with Academy Award nominated composer and Radiohead's guitarist Jonny Greenwood with Tom Skinner, the jazz drummer for the outfit Sons of Kemet. And what we get is almost like a trip through Radiohead's previous discography, just a little more krautrockian, a little more free jazz, and jammy. Tracks like The Same and Open the Floodgates carry a lot of Thom Yorke solo influence, a lot of anima synths going on in there. The Opposite and The Smoke bring out a lot of rhythms that are very reminiscent of something from The King of Limbs. You Will Never Work in Television Again has some of Thom Yorke's most energized deliveries in quite some time, but then you have something like Panavision that's pretty much classic Thom Yorke Radiohead falsetto. We're left with an album that, while it sounds very familiar, is still an excellent set of tracks. Free in the Knowledge is a track that could stand along some of Radiohead's greatest hits. But it's what we've come to expect from these musicians. It's just pure excellence in songcrafting. And while it did make me miss Radiohead that much more, if we get more of The Smile, I don't think anybody's gonna complain. Next up is Everything's Raw Data Feel. As someone who ate up their third record, Get to Heaven, Raw Data Feel was everything I could have asked for and more. All of the singles released before the album scratched a bop-heavy itch that I'd been hoping to get from them since their release back in 2015. But the fact that the rest of the record would end up being an amalgamation of everything that they've ever done in the past, plus an electronic twist, was everything I could have asked for. The latter half of the record is filled with some new wave ballads like Metroland is Burning and Born Under a Meteor. Leviathan is another huge track that gives off its own Radiohead vibes. There's one last surprise hit with Cut Up, a song that apparently almost didn't make the record for being too weird and out there. And then there's the album's closer, Software Great Man, that is just immaculately epic and such a hypnotizing way to end this album. I'm confident in saying that this is Everything's best record since Get to Heaven. I love the more dancier sort of club vibes in tracks like I Wanna Love Like This, a tracks whose lyrics I'm pretty sure were generated by AI to capture the most amount of human attention possible in the least amount of words, while still being catchy as hell. Overall, it's such a fun record with a great variety of sounds throughout the entire track list, making it something that I'll want to return to for the rest of the year. Now for something a little bit more out of left field. It's Charlotte Adigéry and Bolis Pupul's Topical Dancer. Go back to your country where you belong. I've said it before, but I'll say it again. I'm a sucker for disco and house music. And Topical Dancer sits more in the realm of house music, but overall this is a pretty quirky art pop record. This is the pair's debut record as a collective, and it's a project that I hope continues to move forward. They are two fairly unknown acts as far as I can tell. Charlotte has another moniker under the name of Water, which is spelt with 3 W's. But the pair met after their solo music was featured in a cult film, and then their friends just kind of suggested that they head to the studio together and make some music. And thankfully they did, because together, these two make some incredible sounds. The attitude on this record very much reminds me of the alternative dance group Confidence Man. If you've heard of them, it's just this very deadpan, almost witty delivery with some great production. And it's the production on Topical Dancer that steals the show. Bolis Pupul, if I'm saying that right, has created some of the most fun and pristine sounding tech and house music this year. From the insane sub-bass panning of Esperanto, to the creative flares and the dark synths of It Hit Me, and to the wild mixes like Haha. Just listen to this. It won't be everyone's cup of tea, but if you're into minimal house music, art pop, and maybe a little bit of disco, you might find something you like here. If not, they're definitely ones to watch moving forward. There was no way I was going to exclude Jack White's Fear of the Dark.
What's the trick in making my love stick?
Jack White will always hold a special place in my musical heart. I grew up on the White Stripes, and that one Raconteurs track that might as well have been a White Stripes track. But Jack's first of 2 albums of 2022 is exactly what I want from Jack White at this moment in time. There are those who preferred the more stadium-heavy riffs of the White Stripes, and those who preferred more of the folk tunes. And Fear of the Dawn is definitely feeding the former of the two. Those people who love those stadium rock riffs. You get some of the heaviest blues tracks that I think Jack White has ever made in his career with the first couple of tracks. Heidi Ho is very experimental, kind of being this almost hip-hop track that transitions into a folk fireside chant. It's wild, and just an example of Jack White pretty much doing whatever he wants at this point. It's also very enjoyable and consistent throughout. I wouldn't say that there's really a filler track on the album, aside from maybe the Dusk interlude, but it doesn't really take away from the album. It's Jack White taking blues rock and adding his own experimental twist that actually lands more often than not on this record. Next up is The Weeknd's Dawn FM. One of the earliest releases from the year has stood the test of time. Dawn FM doubles down on the sound that The Weeknd brought with After Hours. He even brings back producer Max Martin on here, but it's also embellished a little bit more with the producer 106 Point Never. Dawn FM is certainly a lot lighter and dancier than After Hours, and I just love how much effort you can tell that The Weeknd is putting into the presentation of this whole thing. The whole radio purgatory concept is also just a really fun and creative touch. Featuring Jim Carrey in interludes as like this sort of radio host was something so out of left field that I would have never thought to have heard something like that on a Weeknd album. A track like Gasoline has him doing something a little bit different with his voice that people were either going to hate or going to love. But it's just nice to see somebody as big and mainstream as The Weeknd continuing to surprise and push himself creatively. I think After Hours had the better singles, but Dawn FM is a much better album experience as a whole. And I'm really excited to see how The Weeknd wraps up this trilogy and chapter in his discography. FKA Twigs, Caprisongs.
Got voices in my head.
Now, this is technically a mixtape, but it's just way too good to ignore. Twigs' Magdalene was one of my favorite records of 2019. I made a video about it, kind of dissecting the whole metaphor with Magdalene within it, but it was just such a hauntingly beautiful work of art with Twigs' voice at the center of it all. Caprisongs sounds more like a collection of experimental R&B songs that her and her friends have been putting together over the last couple of years. And initially going into this, I thought this was kind of just a couple of throwaway songs, maybe some B-sides that she was just kind of getting rid of in between projects, but if this is Twigs' B-sides, then her B-sides are better than some people's A-sides. Much more accessible than Magdalene, it almost feels like she thought these songs were too mainstream pop to include in her core catalog, so she just kind of grouped them into a mixtape. Meta Angel, Tears in the Club, and Darjeeling are some highlights from the tape, but overall this whole thing is really enjoyable to listen to, and an unexpectedly strong release. Not that I'd expect anything less from Twigs, it's just a pleasant surprise. Denzel Curry, Melt My Eyes, See Your Future.
As I keep on walking, ain't no stopping in this dirty, filthy, rotten, nasty little world we call a home.
Denzel Curry released the best trap album of the era back in 2018. Rodeo can take a back seat. But what I love most about Denzel is that he doesn't stand still. After Taboo, he would move on to a bit more of a southern hip-hop style with Zoo, an album that, to be honest, I wasn't so hot about, but Melt My Eyes is another transformation for him. The number of eras this album jumps through while still sounding as cohesive as it does is pretty impressive. You've got the jazz stylings on the opening track. You have a boom bop sort of style with Walk It, JPEG Mafia's experimental twist on John Wayne, the pop prowess of Denzel and T-Pain on tracks like Troubles. You have R&B cuts like Angels, trap cuts like X-Wing. Denzel's range and flow just works across all of these, and I'm convinced that the guy can kind of do it all. He's an artist that I think a lot of people like to think is underrated, and I'm almost inclined to agree, but he does get plenty of attention, and I think he will continue to impress people moving forward. I'll also throw in that this is likely Denzel's most introspective album, but Denzel's also not a stranger to being a little bit more personal on his albums. This is by far my favorite hip-hop album of the year so far. Black Country New Road, Ants From Up There. It would almost be criminal to not include Black Country New Road's sophomore release on this list. And while I do enjoy their debut just a bit more, Ants From Up There is as close to a perfect album as you can kind of get. Great musicianship, it's bursting with creativity and a ton of awe-inspiring moments, and a lot of great vocal performances from Isaac Wood. I spoke about them in a video not too long ago, kind of comparing them a little bit to Sufjan Stevens, a little bit of Arcade Fire, especially with this newer record, some great chamber pop moments in the first half of the album that kind of moves towards more of a post-rock feel in the latter half of the album. I think I prefer much more of their post-rock style, so if anything, that makes me more excited for where the band go next, considering that Isaac Wood, their frontman, has kind of bowed out and left the band to figure out their next direction. So I'm excited for whatever they decide to do next. Before I go, I'll leave you with a couple of honorable mentions. First up, Beach House's Once Twice Melody. I don't think this is a grand reinvention for the band as much as it's just kind of grand. It's a very big album. There's a lot of album here. And I think it's an album that's best digested in sort of the way that it was released, in just kind of these 4 to 5 song little chunks, these little bursts of Beach House. It's still Beach House. It's still very moody and atmospheric, and quite possibly their most cinematic album. Then there's Kendrick Lamar's Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, which, to be honest, I was a little underwhelmed by. Nobody in hip-hop is making this kind of album. Kendrick Lamar continues to show that he's on a level of his own when it comes to delivery and songwriting, and I love the whole concept and the narrative thread of him kind of dealing with trauma and grief and where he kind of fits into the cultural zeitgeist of everything. It just doesn't have the replayability of a lot of older albums that I've heard from him, and it didn't capture my attention as much as something like Good Kid, Mad City did back in the day. It is enjoyable. It is something that I'm still digesting, but just not something I'm returning to that often. But that's it. Those are some of my favorite albums from the year so far. Let me know what some of your favorite albums have been from the first half of the year and what albums you're excited for the latter half of the year. Again, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Keep listening.